Hello flower friends! In today's video I'm going to show you how to make a floral head crown with both fresh and dried materials mixed together. My name's Ellen Frost. I'm the owner of Local Color Flowers and I've been a florist for over 15 years. I write a weekly newsletter all about flowers, which you should definitely check out, and I run an online community called Flower More for flower nerds who want more flowers in their life. So making a floral head crown, the technique is pretty easy. It is time consuming. That's the only thing about making them. It's easy, but it takes a while. So I'm going to show you first the materials that I use and then the technique I use to make the crown. The first thing I do is I make the base. I use this flocked wire. We call it velvet wire, but I think if you look it up, the real name is flocked wire. So it's wire. It's just like a light gauge wire with sort of a velvety outside, and that really helps the flowers and the wire, or if you're using tape, stay in place. If you use an uncoated wire, things can slide around a little bit, so I like the flocked wire the best. This is a 24-inch piece, but you can get them in 18 or 12 inches, maybe others, but those are the ones I know of. For an adult, I like to use the 24-inch piece because you can see it like fits really nicely on an adult head. You could cut it down if you had to, or you could wire two pieces together if you needed to too. But the 24-inch piece is the piece that I like to use. The other material that I'm using is this light gauge wire. This is I think an 18 gauge, really flexible, and I'm going to use that to wire my bunches onto the flocked wire. You could use tape if you wanted to, you could use twine, but I really like to use just like this light gauge wire is the easiest thing I've found to use. So to make the base, I'm going to just measure, and then at the ends of each of these pieces, I'm just going to fold over the end and make a loop with a twisting motion. And actually this loop is where I'm going to put the ribbon on at the end. So I'm just going to make these two loops. And now my base is ready to go. You can see it's pretty flexible. So if somebody needed to tie it tighter or looser, they could do that pretty easily. All right, so I have a mix of materials here today, both fresh and dried. So my fresh materials are fresh rosemary. I love using rosemary in head crowns because it holds up really well. And then I have some fresh eucalyptus. This is a new eucalyptus to me, Moon Lagoon, and it has really small petals, and I'm going to use it cut down pretty short and bunched, so I'm not too worried about it wilting. Then I'm going to use some fresh lisianthus. And then for my dried materials, I have some gomphrena. This is ammobium, or winged everlasting. And then I also have German status, which is, I use it in every single head crown because it's so cute and it's dried and it never looks different. It just always looks this cute. So it's not going to wilt. And then I do have a little bit of white status that I might use. I'm not sure yet. I'll have to see. So the process begins with taking your materials. I usually start with some foliage and cutting it down into very small bunches. And this work is tedious, I have to say. You know, making these very small bunches, it does, like I said, it's slow going, and it's also like a lot of, like, your head is down a lot, so make sure you're stretching as you go. So as I begin, I'm going to take my first bunch. I'm going to place it with the greens towards the loop and the stems towards the wire. And then I'm going to take my light gauge wire and I'm going to wire that on. There's no need to tie it in a knot or anything. You can just fasten it nice and tight on there, and that should work. So you can see what I'm working with now. I'm going to just trim my stems a little bit so that they are a little shorter and easier to work with. If you don't trim your stems, things start to get thicker, and you want everything to be sort of evenly thick. So I like to just trim those down. And So you can see I've got them on there. So I'm just going to do the next little bunch with some of this dried ammobium or winged everlasting. And when you're using dried materials, you know, remember that they are pretty, well, they're dry, so they're very delicate. So I might want to, instead of wiring these on with the wire right on the stems, I might take a little bit of foliage or something with a little stronger stem and put it right in the front so that when I'm wiring, I'm actually wiring onto these stronger stems and not onto the dried material. So basically I'm making like a little buffer for the dried material. Like that. So I'm just going to lay it right on top of the bunch underneath it, and then I'm going to wire it on. That's the whole technique. The trick is to make sure that you are making a pattern that you like. So I usually like to do foliage and filler flower until I get maybe to the side, and then I'm going to do some of these more focal flowers. And that's really just preference. If you want all focal flowers across the whole crown, you can use focals all the way across. If you want to have something a little more delicate, something that feels maybe, I don't know, a little more whimsical, then you might want to have filler and then only a few focal flowers as you go. So I'm just making my next bunch. And if you want, you can pre-cut all of your bunches. That might make sense to you. Sometimes I do that, or sometimes I'm just cutting as I go because I kind of want to see how things are looking. So I'm going to put my next bunch on here. I'm going to wire it. So you're never going to cut your wire, this wrapping wire. That just stays on the palette like that. And when you're trimming your stems, be sure you don't cut the wire, the head crown wire. I've done that before. Just be careful of that. You can always wire it back together, but better if you don't cut it. All right, so I'm just going to keep going, making my bunches. So after a few bunches of filler, I might be ready for a little cluster of focal flowers. One thing to remember when you're using focals is that you want to make sure you're using something that's going to hold up and not wilt, especially if the person's going to be wearing it all day. So I'm choosing to use a little bit of pink lisianthus. I'm not going to use much of it, but I do want to include some of that. Lisianthus is a great option because it really does not wilt, and it is really very pretty, especially in these crowns. And these single stems that I have here, very roughly, but also like a perfect size for a head crown. It's not going to feel overwhelming. Again, these stems are pretty soft, so I'm going to try to cover them with a little bit of the rosemary so that I'm wiring onto the rosemary and not right onto the lisianthus stem. So again, I'm just making like a little bit of a buffer on the outside of the lisianthus so that when I wire it, that stem doesn't break off. And you can do a single, you can do a cluster. I think I'm going to do a single and maybe do a pattern then. So I'll go back to my filler and then do a couple of filler and then add another focal. I'm just going to put my last bunch in here. And all in all, this wreath took me about, or this crown took me about 30 minutes to make. It could be longer or shorter, just depending on what materials you're using and how prepared you are. If you have everything cut up in advance, the wiring will only take a few minutes. So this is my last bunch. Just gonna wire this on here. And then I might put maybe one more piece of rosemary or a couple little pieces of rosemary right at the bottom here so that the wire is covered up. Some little short pieces. All right, then I'm going to trim these stems nice and short. Make sure that the wire is nice and tight. And then I'm going to cut my wire finally. You never cut your wire until the very end. And then I'm going to just wrap this around so that it stays nice and tight. You can tie it in a knot if you want, but I found that if you just wrap it really tightly and sort of pinch it against the frame, that will work. So here's my crown. To finish it off, I'm going to use some ribbon. This is just some sheer ribbon that I'm going to put on the ends. This way, you can use any kind of tie at the bottom, but what this allows people to do is adjust the crown to fit their head if they need to make adjustments. So I'm just going to put 2 pieces on here. I'm just going to take this loop and tie it right onto the loop. And I'm just going to knot it. It doesn't have to be. Tie it nice and tight. Trim it. And then I'm going to make sure that my end is cut at an angle. I'm going to do that on both sides. Okay, so that is my head crown. One last thing I'm going to say is I always like to try it on and look in the mirror and then see if I see any holes or places that need adjustment. So if I see any spots where I might like to fill in, there's a couple things I could do. I could stick a little piece of, you could stick a flower in and try to wire it in. I find that wiring, so just sticking it in and then taking a little piece of wire and wrapping it around, I find this to be a harder technique because you really have to wind the wire through the frame. It can get tricky. So the easier way is to do, what I would do is use some cold glue. So Oasis cold glue, it just comes in a tube like this. You can get it at your floral wholesaler or online on Amazon. And this is great for things like head crowns where you just want to add a little something. Let me first tell you that it comes out very quickly. So be careful when you're using it. So you can just take your little stem. You don't even have to use a stem actually on this one. You could just trim the stem all the way down and then put a little bit of glue right on there. And then glue it right in. I also use, I usually try to keep some strawflower around. This is just dried strawflower heads. Sometimes they pop off the stem or we just cut them off as we're drying them. And you can also glue a couple of those on. I like to do that. Strawflower is really pretty and adds a nice little touch to head crowns. So I might just glue a couple of those on as well. If you're using the cold glue, just make sure you hold your flower down so that it really adheres. You should hold it for about 30 seconds. So I might just put a couple of those on throughout. If you had fresh strawflower, you could use those as well. And you could use them with the stem on and wire them in, but this is a good option if you just have some heads and a few little spots you need to fill in. All right, so I would let it dry and then I would just hang it up until I was ready to use it. That is how you make a floral head crown with fresh and dried materials.